5 minutes or so.
Okay, I'm gonna get some coffee. I'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Boy, that was scary. Hold on, let me just now close down everything I've got up here. I'm sorry, I kept trying to come in. Apparently, the link was to a class or with the password of April 15th.
Yeah, that was my fault. I just sent out the right link to everybody.
You know, I'm just thrilled that we all managed to make it here. That's the good thing, right? How is everybody?
Good, thank you.
How are you?
It's been a difficult week. It's been a very difficult week. I've been preoccupied with the challenges of faculty in the seminary where I work not being as mindful as I would hope about the challenges their students are facing. But I also face that problem at UNCC where some colleagues are better than others at figuring that out. Yeah. So
there was an interesting article in the Higher Chronicle of Education about that very fact that students and faculty need to address that this is an unusual situation and that things are different.
yes, indeed. And I would even use a word that's a little bit stronger, thank you, than unusual. It is not only a life-threatening situation, it is a terrifying situation, the like of which we have not seen before in recent history, and which these young people especially are, experiencing as like a massive, serious crisis, probably most of them for the very first time. But it's not like the kinds of crises we've had in recent history. So there's no preparation for it.
Right.
Yeah. So here we are. Well, hoping all of you are staying safe and well. Are you all staying safe and well?
Yes. Yes.
Working hard at that, I hope. Good. Our son just said last night, maybe we should change our shopping habits once again. And only the kids will be the ones to go out doing the shopping. And what that would entail. We are certainly eating some things we've never eaten before because my Korean daughter-in-law is making some occasionally we get these Korean things on the dinner plate, which is really quite interesting. It's now a very interesting, diverse set of foods. I love your background, Pidge. That's wonderful. I have one that has a beach and water coming behind me.
I think this was when we were on a Baltic cruise and we were on a ship, and that was the sunset. It was either that or Norway.
Oh my, it's really beautiful. Well, I will ask, some of you are quite far from the screen, and I am going to ask you, insofar as you and I will make that same effort, can come a little closer. It does help me kind of see your faces, your reactions, your moods, and also if you want to raise your hands to speak. And John, I think we start in 1 minute, right?
We may give it a minute or two because of that wrong link. People are still joining up, so we may give it just a second or two beyond. Pidge, Julie Pepper likes your background too. I can see the YouTube side of things. I have it up on my other screen. So she was commenting on it.
I've also just realized that I had the wrong name up again, but that's the one that is my Zoom name. And then I tried to replace it and I started automatically replacing it with Dr. Tita. And then I thought, wait, wrong hat. Let's try the right one. Which hat have you got on today? Yeah. I hope that some of you had a chance to look at each other's laments. My own is a little later in coming because it's somewhat linked to the fact that this Wednesday is the anniversary of the shooting at UNC Charlotte. And so that's also been in the back of my mind. because that was the last time I wrote a lament, was a year ago for that purpose. And so I've been kind of letting all of this steep a bit, but I hope you've had the chance to look at each other's laments. There has been some extraordinary work, spiritually, socially. Tony?
I can hear John just fine, but I find it very difficult to hear you.
Not again. Is everybody else having that
No,
same
that's
problem?
much better now.
All right, then I need to get closer to my screen is
A
what it
little
amounts
closer
to.
to the mic. Yeah, my hearing is very poor anyway, but I do want to hear you.
Okay, I'll get closer, Tony, and I'll have to say I've never known you to have poor hearing. You've been one of the best listeners I've ever known.
Well, very poor hearing.
There's two different ways of thinking about that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So how many of you, just raise your hands while we get ready, actually did have the time to read each other's laments?
Poor anyway.
Okay, so a good number of you. Wonderful. I'm hoping that you continue to write them, right? That's not the only time. And John, we might want to mute everybody who isn't talking just to avoid too much feedback.
I just did, but I'm gonna mute all. And I'm gonna unmute you, and I'm gonna unmute Glenette and Tony, and I think let's go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning again. It's wonderful to have you all for our second session of Lamentations. I welcome you to the Davidson College Presbyterian Church Covenant class. I'm Glenette Popovich, and I am chair of the Adult Ministry Committee. And we're delighted to have this series that we can present to you. Just a couple of housekeeping again. Your best bet is to put Zoom into speaker view so that whoever is speaking will be the primary person. And you can do that usually in the upper right-hand corner.
It's better.
Be sure to leave yourself on mute unless you want to talk. And if you want to ask a question, in the bottom of your screen, if you hover over it, you'll see a chat feature, and you can ask questions in that place. And also, this is a class, so the same behavior that's in a class is in effect here. And for those who are on YouTube, if you would like to ask a question, you can do that in the comments section. And Claire George Drumheller will be there to transfer your questions into the class here. So Dr. Tony Abbott's going to introduce our speaker again.
Thank you. My name is Tony Abbott. I'm the organizer of the Covenant class. It's been my joy to welcome Barbara Tita for the last, I think, 7 years. And she has become a great friend of this congregation and of this class. She holds an MA and PhD in history from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a second MA from UNC Charlotte's Department of Religious Studies. She is now professor of religious studies at UNC Charlotte, and she is doing a course for us on loss and grieving based on the Book of Lamentations. And I noticed as I got ready to introduce her, I reread the first line of Lamentations about the emptiness of the city. And it seemed so strikingly powerful at this very moment. And I thank you, Barbara, for doing this course. So welcome.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much. So I want to begin with your words, actually, not mine. Alas, the unequal suffering of the people. I cannot touch you except with broken words. I made a list of antonyms to lift my thoughts, smile, laugh, sing. Today is the day we need you. Until you answer, help us hang on. Virtual life is not real life. I feel like a prisoner, and those who decide my fate know me not. People are divided and angry. They're enraged further. My heart hurts to see people blame and become bitter toward one another. People are dying. Nurses and doctors and other healthcare workers are pushed to their limits. Many are hungry. Many are desolate. How long? How long? What you yourselves write, what you yourselves create in this time and in these weeks is an actual gift, in the same way that the Book of Lamentations was a gift to us. Because it's raw and it's honest. And it says where you are and what you long for and what you feel. And that is the gift of the Book of Lamentations, that it does not hold back. I'd like to briefly review what happened last week and then help us enter the work of this week. And then at the end, I'll remind you where we're going to go next week. But I really want to encourage you to keep writing those laments, to keep putting into words how you are experiencing this time, not only for yourselves, but for your families and your friends, your children and your grandchildren. Words matter and words last. Our Book of Lamentations has lasted thousands of years, and it comes to us again and again as a source of freedom and comfort and expression of understanding. Your words matter. So last week, I tried to speak to you about chapters 1 and 2 in Lamentations, in which it is so important to note the figure of daughter Zion, who represents both the city of Israel and really the people entire, and how she makes the case in those first 2 chapters that it is a lie to make meaningful violence, to make meaningless violence, meaningless suffering, meaningful. That she wants to be honest to say, this is just meaningless. There is no answer and there is no way to justify the pain that we are experiencing. So in those 2 chapters, as we talked about last week, she describes God as this fierce hunter who actually stalks and ensnares his own prey, i.e. his people. I'm using, by the way, the pronoun him and his, because that's how the text refers to God. This is a world in which God is, in fact, given a male persona most of the time. So I'll be speaking in the context of the text rather than as we might interpret and speak of God with perhaps gender neutral pronouns. The other thing, because it's important, right? Like God is effectively a male partner to daughter Zion, who is the female partner of God, as I tried to explain last week. In these first 2 chapters, she accuses God of persecuting Zion, of effectively mass murder, of killing God's own children, who are her children, right? The children she bore and that she raised. She makes God responsible for the nightmare of violence that is occurring. Yes, she admits the people have transgressed, but her answer is to say, however we have transgressed, nothing we have done can deserve this kind of horror. So the first 2 chapters almost feel like what we have is a kind of cancellation of the covenant with God, right? The first 2 chapters almost feel like, on the part of the poets' voices, they are the ones saying, this is so much, this is too much. How can we have a covenant with you when you have no reserves in the way that you hurt and harm and plan our devastation and our dismay and our torment? I think that whoever redacted these poems together, and these poems were clearly not written all by the same person and not even at the same time. Like the last poem is the story of a generation later. So clearly there probably was a corpus of laments, in the same way that your class is producing a corpus of laments, and a redactor of some kind chose which to put together. So there's real thinking going on about which poems to choose and in what order. And in the middle of the Book of Lamentations, we have what could be called the monumental center, a poem that is so much longer, right? 3 times longer than the other poems. An acrostic like the others, but which uses the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, each one of them several times, to get the length of this poem. And that monumental center features a very specific character, just as Daughter Zion appears in the first 2 poems, a character called the Gever, which could be translated as the strong man, right? The man of like strength. Gevur is strength. So the Gever appears in this 3rd chapter. And his work, his voice, and what he does in this chapter is astonishing. He starts in one place, he moves to another, and he lands in a third. I want to describe a little what happens with this character, and then briefly speak to what goes on in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And then we'll open it up to questions. But I also want to remind you to interrupt me at any point with questions you have as I'm speaking, and to remind you that it's my nature to sometimes stop my own work and say, well, what do you think of this? And ask for your response, so that it's not just me as a talking head for 35, 40 minutes. So here's the place where the question becomes, what has become of the covenant? God says over and over to the Israelite people, over and over, turn back to me and I'll take you. Always giving the people an opportunity to return, using the word teshuvah. Come back to me, atone. My arms are always open. I think this is something that we share. The vision of God with arms always open to all peoples, to all individuals, no matter where they are, what they have experienced, or even what they have done. That God never turns away anyone who seeks God. Am I right about that? So I think this is the gift that we get already in Hebrew Bible, a deity who would never turn away, would never leave open the possibility of return. And yet in these first 2 chapters of Lamentations, this deity does not speak. And the havoc that is wreaked seems overwhelming to those who experienced it. So what happens in Lamentations 3? In Lamentations 3, we first hear a male voice describing in so many ways the torment that looks like the torment that Daughter Zion describes, right? I am the man who knows affliction under the rod of his wrath. He drove me on in unrelieved darkness. None but he brings his hand down again and again without cease. He has worn away my flesh and skin. He has shattered my bones. All around me, he has built misery and hardship. He has made me dwell in the darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in and I cannot break out. He has weighed me down with chains. And when I cry and plead, he shuts out my prayers. He has walled in my ways with hewn blocks. He has made my paths a maze. I'm sure you can understand why Jews in Auschwitz found these verses to describe their condition. And the Gever continues by describing not only being crushed, his bones shattered, in darkness, in a maze, walled in, worn down, literally made skeletal by the horror that he is experiencing. He also, like daughter Zion, acknowledges God is shutting out my prayer. God is not hearing me. And it is a torment for him to speak about God as an enemy. God becomes a bloodthirsty warrior, a wild beast, a bear, a lion, an archer. All of these figures are figures of torment and aggression. It doesn't stay that way. Where we do experience daughter Zion literally staying in this place of torment with the only emotional reactions of first some self-pity deserved and later some rage against God, right? Real rage. How could you have done this to us? The Gever begins with this litany of near, you can only call them crimes, really, of God. And then struggles. How is he going to go forward? How is he going to find a way out of this place? In this first section, he is only speaking this character about God. Do you notice how he's only speaking about who God is and how God acts? Not to God, but about God. Can you see how that's happening here? Right? It's all a description. God does this. God does that. God does these horrible things. He speaks about God as that enemy. Now he's going to speak about God starting in verses 21 and going through verses 39 in a way that says, what is the nature of this God? How do I explain this deity? How do I understand? In verses 21, right, through 30, if you're looking at this text, you'll see this moment that seems like a really strange reversal, right? God is a bloodthirsty warrior. God has walled him in. God has crushed his bones. But in verse 21, a verse I think that some of you called upon when you wrote your own lamentations and your own laments. But this do I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The kindness of the Lord has not ended, his mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning, ample is your grace. I'd like every one of you to note verse 23, bookmark it. It's going to be important next week in our final class. In the center, almost literally the exact center, almost, of the book of Lamentations, the Gever says, but surely God will return. Surely God will speak to me again. Surely there is reason for me to have hope. And you see, as he goes on, the Lord is my portion. I say with a full heart, this is almost an act of resistance on his part to the horror he's experiencing. I will resist the agony that I've just named. The Lord is good to those who trust in him. To the one who seeks him, it is good to wait patiently. Rescue comes from the Lord. What's your reaction to this? Insistence on hope, even though God does not, God's self, speak in this text. And why does the poet write such words of hope without God answering? Any thoughts about that? Yes, Jane.
As individuals, back then and probably today, we have to fall back on our faith and look for the hope the future will bring.
So Jane is suggesting, though the sound was a little bit difficult, Jane, next time you speak, come a little closer to the microphone. We'll see if it's better. But my understanding is that what Jane was saying is, back then as in now, you have to rely on your faith. Even when God is not answering, when God appears to be absent, you have to rely on your faith. Okay, other thoughts. Why does the poet who writes this, not have God respond? That's a key question. The poet could, God speaks throughout the entire text all the time. Why not here? Well, not throughout the entire text, that's slightly overstated, but talks a lot. God has a lot to say. Not here. Why not? This is the God who spoke to Abraham, the God who spoke to Moses, the God who spoke to Rebecca when 2 infants were struggling and fighting in her womb. Why does the poet not have God respond here? Pidge.
Maybe we have to learn for ourselves how to have hope. Without hope, we're hopeless. But maybe we have to figure that out on our own.
Interesting that the poet is teaching us in times of the worst horror, you may in fact be utterly alone. And it'll be your charge to understand how to hope. God, I'm not going to help you have it easy by having God say, yes, it's okay. Right? Interesting. Other thoughts or comments about that? Why the poet doesn't give us a God who answers the cries of his people.
I'm using the CEB Bible, and the footnote for these verses says that it's showing us it's possible to hold despair and hope at the same time.
I also think I saw Tony's lips move. Thank you, Glynette. If I'm right, Tony, let's have John unmute you. Oh, you unmuted yourself. Good. Okay.
I was thinking of Martin Luther, and then Luther said that it's the absence of God which is his biggest problem. And I think that in this moment of Lamentations, God seems to be absent, and therefore he can't have God speak. I mean, Job can have God speak in the context of Job, but in this context, God does not seem to speak. So it would be a violation of the truth of the moment to have God speak.
Yes, beautiful. It would make it perhaps impossible for people to acknowledge the full extent of their pain and their suffering. The absence of God, in a way, permits these characters and these poets to declare the terrible truth as they know it. There is no palliative. And so the honesty of their pain becomes a raw reality, which is given expression here. I don't think there's anybody in this room who does not know what it is to be at this exact point. I'd be surprised, because everybody in this room has at some point in their life experienced the pain that is so severe that you simply do not know how to put words to it. I can say to you all that for me, the first time I experienced that was during the illness and death of my sister at the age of 42. There was no pain ever in my life before like that pain. Even the loss of one individual beloved to us can be the torment of lamentations, can it not? So he goes on. I think what's going on here, actually, in response to Glennette's commentary, right? I think actually that what we see the Gever doing here is creating hope as an act of will, right? Re-articulating hope here is nourished by nothing, as one commentator has written. It's nourished by nothing but its own desire. His hope is coming out of his own longing. And that is something we need to understand too, because he needs to figure out why he should have reason for hope. And he's going to do it in a way that is a little bit troublesome. He's going to do it by saying what daughter Zion has also said. Yes, we have transgressed. We have in some way sinned. And he's going to do that in verse 39. So if you move to verse 39, right after he's describing first the hope in God, and God will not reject forever. God afflicts, then pardons. Here I'm in verse 31, right? He does not willingly bring grief or affliction to man. When by the time you get to 39, he says, so what should I complain? I should complain of my own transgressions. This is the first time, by the way, in Lamentations that we see the word chet. Remember, I told you there are three words that often get translated as the word sin. One means to do a boundary transgression. An avera, a pesha means a rebellion. That's the word that daughter Zion uses. He uses the word chet to miss the mark, to make a mistake, to, as we might say, sin. Missing the mark can be that serious, right? And so in that moment, he effectively has found a way to transition from God is my enemy. I must have hope that God can be my beloved friend. How do I have to get to that hope? By admitting my own responsibility. Can be that serious, right?
No saying.
So here is my question for you all. Is there anything we have done to bring COVID-19 to our world? Is there anything we have to blame ourselves for? Does this relate?
So I have a question, Barbara.
Yes,
So in verse 31, which you just read, 32, I'm using the NRSV, and it says, although he causes grief, he will have compassion. I would say in our, reformed understanding, we would say that God allows suffering to happen, but I would be hard pressed to say that God causes suffering to happen. What is a Jewish understanding of suffering?
I am so glad you brought that up, because another verse I want you to pinpoint is verse 33. Verse 33, for he does not willingly bring grief or affliction to man, is a critical part of the theology that I think, I don't want to say all Jews, because we're a diverse collection of different kinds of aspects of the tribe. But the idea that God hides God's face from, first of all, from what humans do to each other, right? That there's a whole theology around God turning God's back. This also comes up in Isaiah, where Isaiah also describes a God who turns his face away from humankind, right? What causes God to turn God's face away can be human wrongdoing, can be a horror at what human beings have done. That was the verse, and that was the theology that was so pertinent during the time of the Shoah, during the time of the Holocaust, right? Human beings are murdering each other willy-nilly. God cannot even look upon this, right? And the theology that I certainly represent, and which I think is more widespread, is that no, God does not cause suffering, and we do not do things in which God then answers with punishment, right? That the punishment that we experience for our own actions is the consequence of what we've done to begin with, right? Not the act of God upon us. You are all old enough to remember the signs after Katrina, right? Which essentially said New Orleans brought it upon itself because of the sinful nature of the city. That kind of theology would be abhorrent, I think, to most Jews. God witnesses our pain. God sits with our pain. God even mourns our pain and mourns our violence and our mistakes. God does not wield a staff to afflict us for transgressions we have committed. We ourselves earn the transgression, and we ourselves earn the punishment that occurs just by what we've done. So that's why that question about COVID-19 was somewhat rhetorical, right? Because not a single one of you would say, we brought it on ourselves. We did something that deserved COVID-19, am I right?
But there is a whole slew of our Christian brothers and sisters that subscribe to that.
Yes, there are.
And would say, definitely, God is teaching us a lesson. God is giving us a wake-up call, however you want to say it.
Indeed. How do you feel about that, all of you? God is teaching us a lesson. God is giving us a wake-up call. They are using, actually, a certain kind of understanding of the text of Lamentations here, and they are relying on what we call the theology of retribution, right? A theology that I think your folks in your congregation and the vast majority of Jews would not read into the world. The theology of retribution, for most Jews, died at Auschwitz, if not well before. So what's your reaction to the theology of retribution? COVID-19 occurred because we ourselves, God is punishing us in some way. Wow.
Barbara, yeah, two things. First of all, personally, I would not ascribe to the theory of retribution or theology of retribution. I mentioned Job last week, and a lot of what Job is about, and Job's friends telling him, you've done something wrong, therefore that's why these bad things are happening. But back to your original question, I would say from a scientific point of view, yes, we did do something to create COVID-19. Now, exactly what, maybe we'll never know, but let's just say that somebody in Wuhan got an animal or whatever that had been infected by a bat or something like that, and that created it. So let's just say scientifically, yes, we do have some blame there.
So I think one of the differences is intentionality, right? Do we blame an unintentional act that is a mistake, as opposed, however, to something some of you did do last week and in your Lamentations, which was was to blame how they were responding or not responding, which is a very different kind of thing, because now there's an active, intentional responsibility that is truly at work. The person who might have had this animal at the marketplace infected, like, do they know, could they know, can we judge that in the same way that we can judge the actions of leaders who are making fundamentally critical decisions about whether the people on the front lines have the means that they have as soon as they need it to do the work that they must do to help stop the spread of COVID-19, right? So, but I absolutely hear you that there is some human interaction here around which we can do a little self-blaming. We can ask ourselves, did we ourselves cause an environment to break down because of our absolute lack of care for the planet? Scientifically, yes, absolutely. And our children and our grandchildren will pay the price for what we've done. Looks like Tony has something. Tony, go.
COVID-19 and Ebola and the flu and everything else is part of the way life is. These things are there. COVID-19 in that sense isn't any different from these other things. What is there is our ability to either make it less bad or to make it worse by our faults. And I think that's where we bear the responsibility, is how we handle it, because we can, by our greed and our selfishness, allow it to become worse and worse and worse. So in that sense, we are responsible, so that we have to take responsibility for doing what we can to lessen it to whatever degree we are able to.
I thoroughly agree with you. Yes, every one of us is responsible for flattening the curve. Every one of us makes decisions. Are we going out to the beaches where there are a lot of people going out to beaches when the weather is nice, right? Are we ignoring how many of possibly my students were partying during spring break in ways that were dangerous for them and others? We all heard those stories. And that was happening both in every generation. Sterling, I see your hand up.
Yes, Barbara. I'm looking at a study Bible here, a New International Version, and a comment that's made on verses 39 through 42. As parents discipline children to produce a right behavior, God disciplined Judah to produce the right living and genuine worship. We must not complain about discipline, but learn from it, trusting God and being willing to change. We must allow God's correction to bring about the kind of behavior in our lives that pleases Him. When we're talking about retribution, I guess it's God allowing these things to proceed with purpose, perhaps.
So I think that that's a commentary that I both understand where it's coming from and would note that a number of other commentators have been increasingly unwilling to look at the depiction. If you have any of you read Kathleen O'Connor's The Abusing God? It is a wonderful little book. She's a Catholic theologian, and she wrote about the Book of Lamentations in some of the most moving, exquisite ways possible. I'm actually going to bring some of her work to you next week. And she starts out by saying, if this is the God I'm supposed to believe in, a God who is clearly an abuser, right? A God who punishes to the point of children dying in the streets, right? Starving at their mother's breasts, blood everywhere in the sanctuary. I will have nothing of this God, right? That is a God whose behavior I can't work with, right? And she asks, from the standpoint of Lamentations, is there another way out than to say, okay, I'm going to accept all this violence because it's a teaching violence, right? And I guess the question she asks is, in a way, as parents, would we imagine that it is a useful way to teach our children how to behave, to beat them senseless? Because that's what this text describes, people being beaten senseless. I think this text, therefore, actually does the opposite of that commentary, Sterling, which is to question that very kind of idea, right? There's a lot of pushback here in this text against the idea that this is normative, normal, or right. Right? Instead, we get these little glimmers of theological possibilities. And again, that's where we're driving for next time. What is, the subtle statement that these books make that give us a different vision of God? How does that work? That's why I asked you to pinpoint this incredibly interesting verse, as Kathleen O'Connor does. He does not willingly bring grief or affliction to man. We're going to come back to that. Okay, so let me go on to describe the last piece of what the Gever does, so I can also speak to you a little about chapter 4 and 5. It is now the point at which the Gever speaks to God, right? He's been speaking about God as an enemy, then about God as a source of hope, and now you're going to see the Gever speaking to God. And that actually begins right in this passage starting around 39, 40. He moves, he says, let's lift up our hearts with our hands to God in heaven. Yes, we've transgressed and rebelled. You have not forgiven. Yes, you've clothed yourself in anger and pursued us and slain without pity, right? You've screamed yourself off of the cloud. No prayer can pass through. You have made us filth and refuse in the middle of our peoples. Our enemies rail away against us. And then starting in verse 49, we have a plea. My eyes shall flow without cease, without respite, until the Lord looks down and beholds from heaven. My eyes have brought me grief over all the maidens of my city. My foes have snared me like a bird. He goes on to say, I am lost. I've called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. Hear my plea. Koli shamata. Do not shut your ear to my groan, to my cry. You have drawn nigh. You have said, do not fear. Al tira. You've championed my cause. This is a pleaful prayer that goes on the rest of this verse and more. And he is speaking now, not for himself, but for all his people. He has become a communal voice. Listen to me, hear me, come back to me. His final I is actually a kind of personification of the people's we. Again, it's important. God doesn't show up to explain God's self. All the change that occurs in this chapter is from the perspective of the sufferer. First, God is enemy, then God can't be my enemy, then a plea that not God not be my enemy, but instead my comfort and my hope. Effectively, the Gever is going through so many stages of grief and sorrow that each one of us know. I am sure these stages must look familiar to us. You are my enemy. How could you have done this to me? How could you take this person away from me? How could you threaten my life, right? All of the things that we do. As I said last week, the way my sister described after chemotherapy and stem cell therapy and then discovering that her cancer had spread, what have I done to deserve this? Was the, another stage in the, how could you do this to me? As if her illness were brought on by God. This is kind of a natural move that we make theologically. And this sufferer is describing that move that we make. When we get to chapter 4 and 5, and chapter 4 describes the people's suffering and the betrayal of the leaders, go look at chapter 4 and you will hear voices of your own time. Our priests and prophets betrayed us. Some of you wrote in your lamentations, our leaders have betrayed us. Our leaders are not responding, are not caring for us. And in chapter 5, a generation that is desperate for return, a new generation, not the generation who could possibly have been accused of any transgression or sin, but the generation, the next generation that is going to suffer the consequences. Have you all considered the way that the young people of today will pay the price of the decisions our leaders are making for at least a decade to come? Have you all thought about that? They will pay the price of decisions, I'm repeating myself, our leaders are making now for a decade to come. Their futures are at stake. And I'm going to share my screen to show you a piece of this text that I really want you to be able to see. The last two verses of Lamentations. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself. Let us come back and renew our days as of old. But the very last line of Lamentations is this: for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. I'm curious, how many of you see in your texts, see the verse that is 22 being repeated after the last verse? In other words, do you see, take us back, O Lord, to yourself, as the very ending of chapter 5? Does anybody see that in their texts? No. None of you do? Tony?
Study Bible, but it's the old RSV.
Uh-huh.
It ends with question marks. Or hast thou utterly rejected us, question mark, art thou exceedingly angry with us, question mark. And I think that's so interesting that he isn't making a statement, but according to this text, he's asking a question. I guess they took the question marks out in your version, it doesn't have question marks.
That's because the Hebrew is not asking a question.
Yeah, but
I can read it to you. There is no question in that statement.
But I wonder how they got the question. And this is a text that was used for a very long time as the standard text for Christians. Well, anyway, I just thought.
I think there's a reason for that, Tony.
Is it?
Remember my statement, traduttore, I traduttore, right? The translator is a traitor.
Yeah.
What I sometimes find, and not only in Christian versions of Hebrew texts, but sometimes Jewish ones too, are decisions by the translator that are actually filled with specific theological agendas. I can absolutely confirm to you that the Hebrew implies that there is no implication of a question here. In the Hebrew, it is a statement of fact. This is what you have done. What's interesting about this, Tony, is that your translator has made an equivalent move to what the rabbis do with this text. Yeah. I can't show you this, but in my version, it'll end with verse 23. Truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us, right? And then without a verse number, the verse from 21, take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old, is repeated underneath the whole book of Lamentations. It's because the rabbis couldn't deal with an ending that was so unremittingly negative.
Yeah.
As we originally have. The rabbis didn't have the courage to let this sit with the terror of a text that says, you have raged against us, you have rejected us, so that the hope for return is a big question mark, not the have you done this, but you've done this, so I don't know whether you'll take us back. which is really the final message of chapter 5 and the book of Lamentations. One of the gifts of the book of Lamentations is that it forces us to sit with the uncertainty that we all, at least once in our lives, have surely experienced. Who is God, and what is my relationship to God? I'd be surprised if there wasn't somebody in this room, or if there was no one in this room who at one point or another had that question in heart and mind and soul. Because life is very difficult and humanity is cruel and fate is unpredictable and things happen to our fragile bodies and souls and hearts and minds all the time that we can neither predict nor cope with when they arrive at the door. We live every day with our mortality, and we do our best to put it aside. The book of Lamentations acknowledges the pain of dealing with suffering in its most extreme form. It permits us to rage, it permits us to cry, it permits us to weep. Do you remember all those words I gave you at the beginning? So I want to have at least a few minutes for questions from either the wider audience or from you. But I want to ask you to look at this text as a gift. As a gift from writers from thousands of years before who said, you are permitted. You are permitted to sorrow and grieve and mourn and rage and bewail and weep and cry out. That this text is in our canon was a gift for us all. Thoughts or responses? Okay, I see a couple of people. Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Where, I must have missed something this week. Where do we write the laments to, and where do we read others?
A reminder that you will be sending them to John, who will post them anonymously, and then he will send you a link so that you can read them. So some have already come in. John will probably resend that link. Sterling, did you have something? I think I saw you. You'll need to unmute.
Unmute.
Oops, hold on.
There,
Got it.
It seems to me that the hope lies in the fact that Jeremiah recognized that God keeps his promise. And he knows he keeps his promise because Jerusalem and Judah sinned and were punished for sinning. But God also said that he will be faithful. And so Jeremiah has that hope, knowing that God keeps his promise and that he will return.
We have, thank goodness, not just the book of Lamentations to rely on, right? We have psalmic texts, we have prophetic texts, we have a range of texts that describe the nature of God and the promise of the covenant, right? What this text does is give us a place to lift ourselves into the permission of experiencing doubt and grief and sorrow, but it doesn't do so exclusively. This is not our only text, it's not our first and our last. And as the rabbis say, God's first word is at Sinai. That's not God's last word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Other responses or thoughts?
Barbara?
Yes.
George Gable. Can you see me?
I can, George. And then Leah, I think, has something to say. So go, George.
What was the purpose of the plagues when the Hebrews were in Egypt?
If you want to ask me as the historian rather than the rabbi, as the historian, I'm going to say that in the ancient Near East, one of the big things that goes on in text is my God is bigger and badder and stronger than your God. And so from the ancient Israelite perspective, literally afflicting the Egyptians with plagues and even making Pharaoh's heart more stubborn is a way to prove how much stronger the Israelite God is than Pharaoh. This is the biggest empire on the block with the biggest God on the block, other than over there on the other side of this little people's territory in Babylonia. So from the historian's perspective, this is part and parcel of a particular kind of narrative that we see in ancient Near East. The plagues are also written by two different authors, George, so that's a complicated question. They're woven together, and those two authors have somewhat different ways of thinking about the purpose of those plagues. So maybe I'll come back and do a 3-series piece on what's going on with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Egypt, and give you a longer answer. But because we're short of time, I'm going to give you the historian's answer. Yeah, there are a lot of theological answers, but as I often say to my students, it's complicated. And it depends on your vantage point. Does that help?
Yeah, I didn't know if it's certainly going to maybe help us get rid of Trump.
You know, I did a lot of work at my Passover Seder around just some of the issues of what happens when you have a leader who seems rather like Pharaoh, who has put you in narrow spaces. Yes. Leah, you had something?
Yes, that one of those last verses you shared, the one about take me back to God, or
yes,
not sure the exact wording of that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Made me think about a story my husband shared this week about a young man that he works with, who is in a job that's just relentless, on the go all the time. And he made the comment to his dad, you know, this spring seems like it's the most vibrant, intense spring, beautiful spring I've ever seen. And his dad said, it's because you've slowed down. It's because you haven't been traveling all the time on the go. You've actually had a chance to see it. And that just struck me about this time and of course he's speaking from someone who still has a job and doesn't have to worry about that. But just this time has given some people a chance to actually see creation for the first time probably in a long time, because they've been working and not paying attention to anything around them.
Or see skies that are clearer.
Exactly.
All over the world, we've actually seen what happens when our skies clear up. That's interesting, right? That phrase, that the Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva, that phrase is sung in every Torah service after we have read from Torah and we put our Torah scroll back into the ark. That particular verse is sung right then.
Hey, Barbara, I put the link for the lament in the chat feature. If y'all want to open that up, you can see it's also been emailed to you this morning. Somebody from the YouTube side brought up the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. And part of the lyrics of that, I pulled it up, is there is no shadow of turning with thee, thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not, as thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, which kind of goes along with our text today.
It is pulling straight from the text, right? Great is that verse that I asked you to look at.
Yes.
That little verse, that great is your faithfulness. As we'll see next week, a segment of that verse is part of the very first prayer that Jews say, the very first thing they say every morning. And this will give me a segue into next week. Why would Jewish tradition demand that some of the first words out of your mouth in the morning come from the Book of Lamentations. Right? Really worth our thinking about. What's the signal that's being sent there? And that's what I want to speak to you about in a week. Any last questions? I think we're closing in on our end. So it looks like Ben has something. Oh, no, that seems to be, are you raising your hand, Ben?
Just clapping.
Oh, the clapping, the reaction. I have to learn these. Let me suggest that all of us end in a prayer. Holy One of Blessing, we know that when two sit to study our scriptures, your words, you are with us. We are a diverse group which is united in you and with you, which is a group of your people. Strengthen us all to do the right things, to make the right decisions, to help one another and hold one another in this terrible time. Help us show the compassion we know to expect from you. Help us to show the love we know we can feel from you. Help us. And may we say amen. I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you,
Take care of yourselves.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As they do on Star Trek Picard. Be well, you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.